Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you so much for your warm welcome and allowing me to share a few thoughts with you. It's actually fascinating and incredibly inspiring work that you do with the Raven Task Force, and the amount of care and concern. I'm just sort of picking up a little bit of it. Just gives me the sense that the community is very well cared for. So thank you so much for allowing me to share a few words in that context. Now, I want to be very clear. I am not a parenting expert. And if you're not sure about that, you can certainly speak to my children. In fact, when I raised the topic of my talk this evening, just to get their input of what they think is the proper sort of blend or balance between being authoritative and still maintaining parental authority, my oldest son, who's my biggest fan, suggested a different person come and speak to you. Now, I won't tell you who that person is, but I will tell you that if time permits, I will reference that person by name. If you get that person's name correct, you will win the privilege of driving me to the airport. So, caveat emptor, buyer beware, it's your own risk. But you could certainly be thinking about it. Obviously, the person he had in mind, I shouldn't say obviously, but the person he had in mind is living. Not everybody that I'll reference is alive, but nonetheless, it just gives you a sense that, there's a story of a reporter, and he comes to a wealthy professional, a financier, a banker, who had tremendous success in a variety of different areas in life. And he said, "Sir, how did you achieve such success?" And he said to him, "Easy, 2 words, good decisions." So he said, "Well, that's wonderful. We would all love to make good decisions. How did you come to make your good decisions?" And he said, 1 word, experience. And then he said, "Well, how did you gain experience?" And he said 2 words, bad decisions. And so whatever I bring to you, whatever experience I have to bear, is really the outgrowth of my own process, my own journey. And I think really we learn more about parenting, we learn more about life through the process of engaging in it, like anything else. And even though now you have been introduced to me as Dr. Hoff, and that's wonderful, my actual experience is in chinuch and specifically in school leadership. I had the pleasure of being a colleague of Rabbi Goldbaum when we learned together in the Torah Masorah Principals Fellowship, and have had opportunity to come and speak at Hill Academy. Another school leader that I've had the opportunity to know very well is Mrs. Lisa Stroll over at DOT, who we actually worked together when I was head of school of Torah Day School of Atlanta. So wonderful leaders on many levels in your community. You're in wonderful hands. And so it's a pleasure to speak with you. And I was a little bit unsure if the words that I prepared tonight would hit the point. But what was fascinating and very affirming, but also a little bit concerning, to be very honest with you, is that through Dr. Clark and then Rabbi Goldbaum and Rabbi Steinberg, I don't think I have anything else to add, frankly. There's not that much left, which is the risk of being last. So, it might just be Chazar Sashir, so to speak. It might just be a review of that which was said, which hopefully will reinforce it. But even if expressed with a slightly different perspective, may add value. And I'm hopeful that I'll be able to do that with you. Back in the day, Rabbi Beryl Wein often talks about this, the great rabbi as well as the Jewish historian. And he speaks about that we oftentimes have this nostalgic view of Jewish history. That back in the day, things were always so wonderful and so rosy. And oftentimes, specifically amongst the Ashkenazic community, we think of Eastern Europe and the shtetl in a very homey kind of way. It's like Tevye on the roof. And, if I was a rich man and everything is so glorious, walking around with cows and cheese and fiddlers, and life is just so glorious. And the reality is it was a very difficult life. People were poor and discriminated against and limited in so many ways. And I reference that because I think oftentimes we have this nostalgic view of parenting as well. Back in the good old days, parenting was so easy. It was an authoritative approach, and the kids would listen and whatnot, and now we've got it so difficult. I'm not sure. I haven't been around that long to sort of live through the entire process, but I do think that we have certainly experienced a pendulum in the parenting experience, if you will, in the 60s and before. Authoritarian was the way to go, or at least that was the thought. Until the late 60s and beyond, we started to see a different type of youth. And those people grew up, and often then we encounter what we might call a permissive form of parenting. And permissive really doesn't work the same way that authoritarian doesn't work. The authoritarian approach ultimately really creates distance, and especially in today's day and age, children don't respond to that type of approach anymore. The idea that I told you so, and the idea that I said so and I'm stronger, more powerful than you, it doesn't resonate. And yet at the same time, the permissive approach doesn't either. And as Dr. Clark talked about, there are so many children who are struggling today and have struggled in the past because they didn't have the parental figure in their life that they needed. They didn't have that strong backbone, if you will, that gave them guidance and direction and respect and courage and support. So we need to find a balance here. So we've got a confused society, and oftentimes for us as parents as well, since we've seen both models, we oftentimes don't know what is the appropriate approach. And when we have children that are looking for it and they don't necessarily respect authority, it can be difficult. There's a story that is told that involved President Nixon together with Prime Minister Golda Meir. And President Nixon was talking about the issues of the time, and as you can imagine, they lived in a very difficult and interesting time, late 60s, early 70s, when they were leading their respective countries. And President Nixon lamented to Golda Meir how difficult it is to be the president. I think the number at the time was about 250 million American citizens. It's a tough job, and to be the head of the free world in the Cold War. 250 million Americans, very difficult job. And she quips in the way that was uniquely Golda Meir's, Mr. President, it is certainly difficult to be the president of 250 million civilians. I am the prime minister of 5 million prime ministers. And anyone who knows any, people who live in Israel know that opinion is not in short supply. So she understood, and we all see it today. No president can do almost anything without a wide range of feedback, not all of it super positive. So we've got this balance, and we have to figure out what is the right authority to maintain. Now, I think it's important for a moment just to talk about what is our responsibility as parents, right? The whole chinuch piece. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? And to talk about it in a way that positions our children not only for the short term, but really for the long term as well. It's fascinating. I'm almost certain that there's only one pasuk, only one verse in the entire Tanakh, in the entire written Torah, that refers directly to the topic of education. Only one, and it's not in the Bible itself. It's in Sefer Mishlei and Proverbs, where Shlomo HaMelech says, King Solomon, Chanoch lenar al pi darko, educate the child according to his way, gam ki yazkin lo yasur mimenu, so that when he gets older, he will not deviate from it. So we have to take the long view of our parenting. We have to understand that it's not just the corrective behaviors that will get us to a better place tomorrow or today. We want to be thinking about how do we set our children on a path that they are going to embrace for the long term. They're going to embrace the values, the tradition, the way of life that we hold so dear. And it begins with the concept of choice. It begins with the concept of bechira. You may be familiar, there was a great rabbi that lived not all that long ago named Rav Eliyahu Dessler, wrote a sefer called Michtav Eliyahu, or at least it became a sefer, collection of his writings. And he talks about something that was revolutionary at its time and has become so widely accepted, it's almost like, how could we think otherwise? And he talks about the idea, the struggle that we have with our Yetzer Hara, with our evil inclination. The idea that we have two competing forces within us at all times, the Yetzer HaTov, the positive inclination, if you will, and the Yetzer Hara, which gets a head start and seems to be the driving force so often. And he says that when we make choices, when we struggle with various things, whatever those may be, we don't struggle necessarily all in the same place. For example, the observance of Shabbos, the Shabbat, right? Some people may have grown up experiencing and observing it the entire time. They don't feel this compelling urge to walk over to the light switch and flick it on the Shabbos. Somebody who is relatively new may have a different feeling, a different experience. Maybe that earlier person, their struggle when it comes to Shabbos has to do with the prayers. or maybe the level of Torah study on the day, or maybe the level of sanctity that they infuse within the day. Our struggles are different, and it moves back and forth. Think of it from a military standpoint, or for those of you who are into football, right? Think of it literally as a game of football with a moving line of scrimmage. And the struggle between the competing forces is constantly moving depending on which side is advancing the ball, or which side is advancing along that continuum of the battlefield. So we're constantly struggling with our Yetzer Hara. And our job, Rav Dessler says, as parents, is to position our children closest to the side of good, so that their struggle is a struggle within that space. And I'll quote exactly what he says. Education plays a large role in determining one's point of bechira, of free choice. A person may have been brought up to do many good actions as a matter of course. In this case, his point of bechira will not be whether to commit an actual sin, but whether to do a mitzvah with more or less devotion and concentration. We see that education and environment cannot in any way change the essential act of bechira, but only the location at which it takes place. So our job is not to choose for our children. Our job is to put our children in best position to make the right choices for the short term and also for the long term. And of course, it's going to look different with a 6-year-old than with a 16-year-old. But that ultimately is the goal. And so in order to achieve what we're trying to accomplish, which is the very delicate balance between being authoritative and being on the other extreme, of course, very permissive, finding the right level of authority, I'd like to propose we focus on 2 key areas. One of them is education, and the other one is influence. We have to educate our children, and we have to be an influential presence in their lives. And there's a lot in each one, and we could probably spend many hours talking about each of them on its own merits. But I'd like to focus on a few key points that I think will really drive home the point. On the educational side, I'd like to discuss, number 1, establishing family values, which was touched on by Rabbi Goldbaum briefly before. Number 2, another point, leading by example. And number 3, setting boundaries. Let's talk about each of those. What are your family's values? Now, let me tell you what we did in Atlanta as head of school so you get the context. We established values for our school. The ones we happened to choose were SFRR, safe, friendly, respectful, and responsible. We called it the SAFER program. And it was a way that we kind of defined who we were as people and the kind of behaviors we wanted to see in our school. And it therefore allowed us to refer to any behavior as being consistent or inconsistent with the values that we established. So therefore, what does safety look like in the bathroom, on the school bus, in the common grounds, in the play area? What does respect and responsibility look like, etc., etc.? We had the values, then we applied them, and we were able to reinforce objectively, not subjectively, because we had those values. The same concept applies at home. Having a conversation with your children, what are the values that we want in our house? We want a house where we feel safe. We want a house where we feel respected. We want a house where we have open lines of communication. Those will look different in every house. You'll all have your own, and too many is not a good thing. But when you have those values, you can then have conversation around it, you could reference it often, and it becomes less personal. So you educate them by the values you establish. That's the first point. The second one is to lead by example. Rabbi Goldbaum offered one idea. I'm going to mention a quote from the Kotzker Rebbe, same concept. If you really want your children to devote themselves to Torah, then you must spend time over the Torah. And they will do as you do. Otherwise, they will not devote themselves to Torah, but only tell their sons to do it, and so it will continue. So if you want your children to do what you want them to do, you have to model it for them. You have to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. As the Gemara tells us, what a child says in the street comes from his father or from his mother. Today may be a little bit broader because we have so much exposure, but certainly it starts from the home. There's a story of a Rav monk who lived, I believe, in France in the years leading up to World War II. I believe that's when it occurred. I went to look for the story that I read many years ago and I couldn't find it. And as you may be aware, Jews of Germanic descent, what we call Yetis, the boys from a certain age already before bar mitzvah wear a tallis, wear a prayer shawl when they pray in the morning. It's different than other Ashkenazic communities. He had a son who went off to yeshiva, and the son, as you can imagine, there's peer pressure. You sometimes feel a little bit out of place when you look different than other people. The son decided he didn't want to be different than his peers. He left his tallis at home. He got on the train, traveled for many hours to a city in Eastern Europe, wherever the yeshiva was located, and his father walks into his room. He sees the tallis on the bed. He picks up the tallis, and instead of sending it with somebody, instead of putting it in the mail, he goes and he boards the train, and he spends many hours traveling, and probably from the train on horseback or wherever they got to the specific yeshiva, and he delivered the tallis to his son, maybe a brief conversation, got back on the train, and came home. It was so important for him that the family tradition be maintained, and he did it with love, but he did it. And he felt it was important enough to show that commitment to tradition and commitment to what's right, that he wouldn't allow somebody else to do it. And he gave it a full day, probably, if not more, to make sure that that message was communicated. The last one, on the side of education, and this is the one we probably struggle with the most, is to set boundaries. Boundaries and rules, and we have to have them in our homes. But we cannot have that permissive environment as we talked about. It's critical that we insist on our respect. There's a story also, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, that was mentioned before. Different story though. Okay, hey, I got something new. And Rabbi Yaakov was on an airplane with his grandson. Famous story, you may have heard it. On an airplane with his grandson, and the grandson is engaging with him in the most respectful way, caring for him. He was already elderly. And there was a man sitting nearby who was just amazed by the level of care and concern and respect. And he had grandchildren too, and they barely talked to him. You know, they barely acknowledged him. Maybe he was good for a present or something. But he certainly never received that type of love and that type of respect. And he said the following, a fascinating concept. He said, in our tradition, we believe that the greatest generation that ever lived in the world was the generation that experienced the receiving of the Torah at Sinai. That when Moses came down from Sinai with the Torah, and then for 40 years, the Jewish people studied the Torah without having to worry about their physical needs, they achieved a level of spirituality, a level of connection, unseen since that time ever subsequently. And therefore, we believe that every generation that came afterwards is a generation further removed from the source. And therefore, by extension, every generation prior is a generation closer to the source. So my grandchild sees me as a link in the chain to the tradition that he has today, and sees me as someone superior to him for that reason. And therefore, I am deserving of respect by virtue of my place in the chain of tradition and the fact that I have transmitted that to subsequent generations. You, on the other hand, come from a society that seems to feel that the further along we move in life, the more advanced we become. And he used the analogy of evolution. And the idea that the further we live, the more human we become. The less ape-like we are. And as a result, the closer we are to today, the more we deserve respect. So from that point of view, your grandson is superior to you and does not demonstrate that level of respect. Either way, whether you agree with the specifics, the point is not that as much as we need to be able to communicate that we are part of a tradition. We need to be able to communicate the beauty of our tradition, also the fact that we are necessary pieces of it. You wouldn't necessarily communicate it as such, but that's an important message. But when you communicate whatever rules you establish, and however you frame that to your children, remember to do it with gentleness and with love, as was communicated before. And always, if you do have to rebuke, end on a positive note. So Rabbi Abraham J. Torsky, when he was young, before he became rabbi and certainly before he became doctor, was a prodigy and was particularly good at the game of chess. And the story goes that in his house at the time, there was a rabbi who was, I guess, visiting a young fellow, staying with the Tversky family, and it was on the day of Rosh Hashanah, on the high holiday, and it's not typically considered to be the appropriate thing to play chess, at least in certain circles, on Rosh Hashanah. So Abraham was convinced by this other rabbi person to play with him anyway, and so he did. Abraham's father later heard about this, and he called him in, and he said, "Did this really happen?" And he said, "Yes," and he expressed his disappointment. But as Abraham was about to get up and leave, he turns to him, and with a twinkle of the eye, he says, "You checkmated him, right?" So he wanted to kind of like, acknowledge his greatness and acknowledge the fact that he still loved him and all of that. So let's move now to the second piece, the piece of influence. We read about this not that long ago, the story of Yosef HaTzadik. Joseph comes down to Egypt in one of the most difficult circumstances you could possibly imagine. He's young, he's disconnected, he's in a foreign land that speaks a foreign language, he's imprisoned, everything is going wrong. But in the years before that prison, he had still been exiled, maltreated by his brothers, and the incident with Ashes Potiphar, where she attempts to seduce him and engage with him in a manner that was clearly below his spiritual status, if you will, Chazal tell us that it was the vision of Yaakov Avinu, the sight of his father that Yosef beheld in his mind, that allowed Yosef to step back and run away and avoid the terrible outcome that awaited him had he allowed his guard down and to pursue the act that she was so aggressively pursuing. So here he was, super vulnerable, and yet it was the view of his father that held sway and kept him away from doing that kind of sin. So we have to ask ourselves, how can we go ahead and achieve a level of influence? And 3 points I'd like to mention. Number 1, to be great listeners and create a safe space for our children. Number 2, to demonstrate love, not a desire for control. And number 3, to personalize our relationship and approach with each of our children. Let's talk about each of those. First of all, we have to be able to listen to our children, especially those who are doing things that are not necessarily super comfortable for us. And I will tell you from personal experience, it can be difficult, right? But our children need us to be listeners. And they need us to be able to genuinely listen, not listen to be able to respond, but listen to be able to listen. Listen to just be there for them. And so often, children that find a different path in life, that live a life that we're not happy with, it's because of the fact that they felt they couldn't confide in their parents at a time that they were vulnerable. They didn't feel that their parents understood them. They didn't feel that their parents really wanted to hear from them. They felt that their parents just wanted to tell them differently. So it's important, if you want to be influential, to create a space where you can be a good listener and allow them the space to open up. Piece number 1. And number 2, we have to demonstrate love and not a desire for control. There's a story, it may not resonate for us today because it happened about a half a century ago in a time when corporal punishment was considered more normative, but hear the story nonetheless. Rav Elia Lapian was one of the great mashgichim in Europe, and he had a tremendous influence on many students. And later on he moved to Eretz Yisrael, where he became a mashgiach in the yeshiva in the Negev, I believe it was Afikim, I'm not sure. Anyway, so he would position himself in a certain place in the Beis Medrash where the students would have to pass every day, and he would know when they came in for Shacharis, when they came in for davening. There was one boy who figured out how he could get into the room through a window and get to his seat late and not be noticed by the mashgiach. Clever guy. Later on, the mashgiach sees him, Rav Elia sees him, he knows that he never notated that he was there. He says, "How did you get here? I didn't see you." And he made up something, and eventually it became clear that he had done what I described before. And Rav Elia became incensed because he valued truth more than almost anything. And here's the line I'd like to share. He said, "If you knew how much I loved you, I would slap you right now." If you knew how much I loved you, in other words, slapping was considered to be an appropriate response for lying, but he held himself back because he didn't feel that the boy knew that it would be coming from love. He thought that it would be coming from a different source, and it wouldn't be received the way that it would need to be received. So we need to understand that influence ultimately is driven by the love that we generate. And there was an Israeli educator that helped kids who were a bit wayward, who were having a hard time. And he asked the boys, and he said, what can a parent do to help his child fight the influences that you're dealing with? What can I do to ensure that it won't happen to my kids? And they said, Rabbi, don't worry, it's not going to happen to your kids. He says, how do you know? And they responded, you love your children very much, and you show them how much you love them. To be in such a house is the greatest pleasure in the world, and they have no attraction, no desire to pursue any other path. And I would encourage you, sometimes it feels a little uncomfortable for different people, tell your children all the time how much I love you. And I've done this with my children, and I have the following. It's fascinating, because I don't do it every night. But I say to my kids, do you know that I love you? And they say, yes. How do you know? Because you tell us all the time. That's what they say. So clearly I say it often enough. But that's the idea. We have to be able to say that. And then the last one. Everybody wants to be treated as an individual. And oftentimes we have this tendency to throw all of our kids under one approach. Kind of like the cookie cutter parenting approach, whatever that is, for all of our kids. But we need to personalize our approach for all of them. Chanoch lenar al pi darko. It has to be based on the unique needs of each individual child. And Rav Hirsch goes so far as to say that this is a controversial statement, but he goes so far as to say that the reason that Esav became Esav is because Yitzchak and Rivka parented Yaakov and Esav in the exact same way. And if they parented each of them differently, according to their each unique qualities and their needs, they would have had a different and more positive outcome. So we can see even to that level that giving our children the individual and the unique focus and attention and guidance and love and support is all essential in creating the right kind of environment for them to thrive. So to briefly review before I wrap up, number one, we have to educate our children. And the 3 points we talked about, establishing values in the house, leading by example, right? Do as I do, not just do as I say. Setting boundaries and making clear that these boundaries are important for you as much as they're important for us. And then inspire them, and do so by listening well and creating safe spaces, by demonstrating love, and personalizing our relationship and approach with each of our children. And I'm going to leave you with one last thought. It's a fascinating story, very powerful, and I actually just read it on my way over here this morning. The story involved a father and a son, and the father would learn with his son on a nightly basis. One night, I think this story happened in Israel in the city of Bnei Brak. One night they finished learning. I guess the son went home in advance of the father. Maybe the father stayed to learn later. The boy walks out into the street, gets hit by a car. The car has a sizable dent in it from the impact. The boy's lying on the floor, clearly looking to be in serious condition. After a short while, the boy walks up on his own accord and makes his way home, or is able to just move on. And everybody understood that clearly this was a supernatural occurrence. This was not normal. This boy certainly should have been minimally in the hospital in a serious way. And nobody knew what to make of it, and the boy's father was perplexed. And the friend of the father said to the father, I will be seeing Rav Chaim Kanievsky soon. I'll ask him what to make of this, and what could you do as a Sudas Haudah or some kind of gift that you're going to give as a source of appreciation, demonstration of gratitude of this supernatural occurrence. So the answer that he got back was as follows. Find a child who doesn't have parents, or doesn't have parents that care for that child, and do something meaningful for that child, such as paying the child's tuition, school tuition for a year. And when the father heard that, he was like blown out of the water. Why? Because a short while before, he was on the tuition committee of a local school, or maybe there was just an involved conversation in the community for a particular set of children whose parents had separated, and they weren't functioning effectively as parents, and there was nobody to pay for the children's tuition in school. And so this father had volunteered to pay the tuition to ensure that the child would have a successful year and be able to stay in yeshiva. And it was in the schus, it was in the merit of that act, which he did with no strings attached, but he just did it because he knew that there was a child in distress, that ultimately saved the life of his child in the incident that followed afterwards. And this is important because we need to continue, no matter what we do. Let's say we follow all of the things that were discussed tonight 100%. Think of ways to enhance chinuch in our community. Think of ways to enhance the efforts of the synagogues and other communal organizations and the wonderful work that's being done here and elsewhere in order to ensure that we are creating the kind of, let's call it spiritual envelopment or I don't even know what the proper term is, but creating a sense where we care for one another, and hopefully through that there will be care for our children as well. Right? Because ultimately, as they say, it takes a village to raise a child. We need the help of others, and hopefully that influence and that the schus, the merit that we create, will provide the outcome that we want and provide ultimately the final line, so that we can say when we look back at it that we had the right level of authority, but at the same time our children developed into the kind of free-thinking Jews that choose, because they're the ones who saw what was right and made the right decisions as a result. So Hatzlacha Rabba to all of us, and we should only have much nachas from our children, and we should be zocha to see them continue to follow in our footsteps and exceed our expectations moving forward. Thank you very much.